Our gospel reading for this morning comes to us from the gospel according to Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. We are continuing with our fall sermon series on the parables of Jesus. And if you would like to read this parable at the same time that you are hearing the parable, I would invite you to do so at this time using the pew Bibles there in your pews. It can be found on page 853 of that Bible. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As I trust that some of you already know, our church is going to be celebrating its 75th anniversary next year. There is a committee that is already in place, appointed by the session. That committee is doing excellent work, starting to make plans for this wonderful celebration in our congregation's life together. I am, needless to say, very excited about the celebration that we'll have next year and very humbled to be with you as we anticipate this joyful and momentous event in the life of our church. I'm also reminded of a story that the Reverend Lillian Daniel tells about a church she once served, a church that was marking the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the laying of the cornerstone of their building. It was a church in New England that had had its share of hard times and conflicts through the years, but this 75th anniversary was an occasion to rejoice, and they wanted to get it right. So this church took 2 years to prepare for this wonderful event. A special worship service was planned, a party was put together, all sorts of committees were behind the scenes at work for this one, and it went on for the better part of 2 years. The anticipation was building, everyone was ready. Then, the Reverend Daniel writes, about a month before the big day, it came to our volunteer church historian's attention that there had been a mistake in calculating the date. Not the wrong day, not the wrong month. We had the wrong year, she said. Our building's 75th anniversary had actually been the year before. Reverend Daniel began getting calls from colleagues saying, "Really? Really? Your entire church missed its anniversary?" As Daniel puts it, in historic New England, missing your own church's anniversary was considered pastoral misconduct. Okay, help me out here. On the timeline out there, it says we started in 1947. You math whizzes out there, can you get there quickly? 57, 67, 77, 87, 97, 2007, 17 plus 5 is 2022. That's 75. Okay. I mean, it's a humbling experience to make a visible mistake. But we all do it, right? We all make mistakes, errors in judgment. I'll never forget the time when I had just started at another church years ago, and an older woman, just wonderful woman of the church, pillar of the church, she was walking into the worship service one Sunday morning, and I was greeting people before they came in, and I said, "Hello, Jess, how are you?" And she smiled at me, and she said, "Ben, it's Jean, not Jess." And I was more than embarrassed. I was mortified. Not simply because I had called her by the wrong name, but because Jess was the name of her recently deceased husband. I had never met him, but I had heard stories about him. Wonderful person in the church, and I saw her and I called her by his name. Mistakes are not just common experiences, they are humbling experiences. Of course, switching a name around or getting a date wrong, those are innocent mistakes, but there are times when the mistake does not appear quite so innocent. Just take our parable for today, a story of two prayers offered in the same temple. The Pharisee says, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." The tax collector prays, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And which one made the mistake? You can shout it out if you'd like. The Pharisee, right? Yes, the Pharisee. It's always the Pharisee. The Pharisee who thought too highly of himself. The Pharisee who exalted himself instead of humbling himself. In our gospel narratives, it is always the Pharisee who's making the mistake. So, if I looked out at all of you gathered here this morning and I said to you, "I see a bunch of Pharisees in the pews here today," would you take that as a compliment? No, exactly. I imagine you would hear it as me insulting you. You might think I'm accusing you of hypocrisy or just a lack of humility that exists with our Pharisee in the text today. But before we go any farther with this parable, we need to remember something. Contrary to the popular Christian imagination of our day, Pharisees in Jesus' day were not bad people. They were good people. Give me a church full of Pharisees any day. I mean, Pharisees were committed to following Jewish law, the Torah. Pharisees were committed to tithing, giving away 10%. Pharisees were respected teachers. In Jesus' day, Pharisees were not seen by the populace as hypocrites. They were leaders, people who walked the walk as well as talked the talk. For evidence of this, just look no further than the Apostle Paul. Do you remember what Paul was before he was blinded on that road to Damascus by Jesus? Do you remember how he referred to himself? He was a Pharisee. And even after he became a follower of Jesus, he never considered being a Pharisee to be a character flaw. In fact, he saw it as a mark of distinction. In the book of Acts, when the Apostle Paul is standing before the council and he needs to defend himself, he says to them, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. Not just I was, but I am." Look, if I were to describe a modern day Pharisee, I might say it's someone who gives 10% of their money to the church, who has exemplary worship attendance, who is respected in the faith community, who has served on the session at least 3 times, who is generous, dependable, always ready to say yes to her church. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying any of you out in the pews are Pharisees like the Pharisee in this morning's parable. I'm just saying that when I look at you, I see a lot of faithful, generous, dependable, committed people in our pews today, and I'm saying that the Pharisees were faithful, generous, and dependable people as well. So, what are we going to do with the Pharisee that's in our parable today? This Pharisee who thanks God that he is not like the tax collector over there. What should we do with him? Well, here's an idea. We could sit in judgment of him. Now that would be kind of fun, right? Let's shame the Pharisee. Let's scold the Pharisee. Let's kick the Pharisee around a little bit this morning. I mean, that would be kind of fun. But before we do that, perhaps we ought to remember that we all get caught up in the sin of the Pharisee. Even though we are not the Pharisee, we are all prone to, at different times, comparing our ways, comparing our opinions to somebody else's opinions. Have you ever done that before? You can just, nod your head right here. Yeah, you see, as the pastor Matt Fitzgerald put it recently, Silicon Valley loves to exploit this. They keep thousands of employees employed through Facebook or Instagram or whatever in what the writer Gia Tolentino describes as the exhausting performance of our righteous online lives. Our righteous online lives. And you don't have to call someone out on social media to know about this. It can happen anywhere at any time. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 phrases right now. And I want you to think about how you feel when I say that phrase. I want you to think about where you stand and what your opinion is when I say that phrase. Black lives matter. First phrase. The recent Texas abortion law. Second phrase. Vaccine mandates. That's the third phrase. Now, let me invite you not only to think about how you felt when I said those phrases, let me invite you to consider how you feel toward people who stand on the opposite sides of any of those issues from you when they post something on Facebook, huh? Do you have that feeling in mind? That's the problem that our parable poses, because we all have issues that we feel strongly about. So how do we approach these issues with a sure and certain argument in one hand and humility in the other? It is especially hard, I think, because we do not see everything we need to see all the time. The Reverend Mark Fenstermacher is a Methodist pastor who tells the story of the time, much earlier in his career, when he was a young pastor in his mid-20s, sent to a church that had recently had a fight. Church fights, I'll tell you, they are the worst. They breed all sorts of self-righteousness, and half of that church's members had left by the time Mark arrived. So he went about visiting people in the congregation, both people who had stayed in the church and people who had left the church. But he admits that he did not know what he was doing or how to handle the pain that he discovered in this recently conflicted congregation, and he was baffled about what to do when the anonymous letters started arriving in the mail and the silent phone calls came to his home. They were never directly threatening, he writes, but they were unsettling. Someone who knew me very well and was a part of the congregation was writing letters, and on phone calls, someone would stay on the line without saying anything. Finally, one day, he figured out who it was, and he decided to pay this woman a visit. I called Betty and asked if I could come over. It was a warm summer day, and I knocked on the back door of the farmhouse. We sat at her kitchen table. We made small talk for a few minutes, and then I told Betty that I knew she had been making the anonymous phone calls and writing the letters. Mark goes on. There are times when you suddenly see something you have missed. As the words came out of my mouth, I suddenly saw another piece of the puzzle that made it impossible for Betty to have been the caller and the letter writer, but the words had been spoken and they sat there on the kitchen table between us. I braced myself for a storm, he said, a storm that would break over my head. I waited for Betty to promise that she and her family would never again darken the doors of this church while I was there. Betty looked across at me, and I saw disappointment in her eyes. But there was no storm. No, Pastor, she said quietly. I didn't make those phone calls or write those letters. Then Betty said, Pastor, would you like some sweet tea? Yes, ma'am, Mark replied. Betty poured a glass of sweet tea, sat there with Mark. They drank the tea. We talked about the family, the farm, weather, and the church. When the tea was gone, she let me pray. She walked me to the door, shook my hand, and said she would see me that Sunday in church. Mark concludes, now when I think of grace, I always think of sweet tea. Sweet tea reminds me of the afternoon when grace came to me unexpectedly, and despite my foolishness, a saint of the church held on to me. That's what Jesus wants, right? He wants us, despite our mistakes and our foolishness, to hold on to one another. So what should we do with this Pharisee today? Should we scold him? Should we shame him? You know what we could do? We could try to hold on to him. I mean, I could try and talk to him. I could try to talk with him or find someone out there who could talk with the Pharisee, not about how wrong he is, but about how good God is. Someone who could help expand the Pharisee's imagination about the goodness of God and the grace of God, to try and get the Pharisee to see that his relationship with God is not dependent on all the good things he has done, boom, 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 but is dependent on his relationship with that tax collector over there. Jesus says that the Pharisee was standing by himself and the tax collector was standing far off. There is distance between these two people, and I suspect that Jesus told this parable because he wanted the distance between people to disappear. So, I was going to ask Mark Fenstermacher if he was available to talk with the Pharisee, but you know, he's probably busy with his own church in the pandemic right now and doesn't have time to talk with the Pharisee. Who would be a good person to talk to the Pharisee? You know who came to mind? The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. In 1849, a young Fyodor Dostoevsky was imprisoned in St. Petersburg with a group of other revolutionaries and sentenced to die. This was before the great Russian writer had become a great Russian writer. Dostoevsky and the other prisoners were marched out into a square in their burial shrouds. The firing squad gathered, the drums sounded, death was seconds away. Then, at that instant, a messenger arrived on horseback. It was part of a prearranged plan. The execution was to be stayed by the clemency of the Tsar. The prisoners responded to this event in different ways, but Dostoevsky was brought back to his cell and suddenly overcome with joy. I cannot recall when I was ever as happy as on that day, he later said. I walked up and down my cell and sang the whole time, sang at the top of my voice, so happy at being given back my life. When I look back on my past, he wrote to his brother a short time later, and think how much time I wasted on nothing, how much time has been lost in errors, laziness, incapacity to live, how little I appreciated it. Now my life will change, he said. I shall be born again in new form. Life is a gift. I think Dostoevsky would be a splendid person to talk with the Pharisee, to show the Pharisee that life is not an achievement to be earned, but a gift to be received. Dostoevsky would make a great person at modeling for the Pharisee what humility is like, what you do when you make a mistake with your life, to get a second chance at life. There's just one problem. Fyodor Dostoevsky is dead. Did you know that? He's been dead for 140 years. I'm going to have to find someone else to talk with this Pharisee. Do you think you could do it? Do you think you could talk with the Pharisee? Do you think you could show the Pharisee the breadth and depth of God's love? How God's love is bigger than any of us have ever been able to imagine? Because you see, that's the problem with the Pharisee. It's not that his ego is too big. It's that his faith imagination is too small. Do you think you could tell the Pharisee that the greatest mistake all of us make is to imagine a God who is far too small? I need someone who could show the Pharisee that God's ways are much more graceful than our ways, and God's truths are much more penetrating than our truths. And God's judgments are much more gentle than our judgments. I need someone who can show the Pharisee how in God's kingdom the love and grace of God is there for the tax collectors of the world, and for the thieves and rogues and adulterers of the world, and for the older brothers of the world and the younger brothers of the world, and for the sheep who always seems to get lost, and for the 99 sheep who always seem to stay at home. I need to find someone who can tell that Pharisee and show that Pharisee that God's love is there for the early morning workers and the midday workers and the Johnny-come-lately workers, and for the priests and the Levites and the Samaritans of the world, and how God's love is even there for the Pharisees when they get caught up in thinking that their value in God's eyes is an achievement and not a gift. Do you think you could not only talk to the Pharisee, but learn to love him? I know. I can tell what you're thinking. Even through your masks, I can tell what you're thinking. You're thinking, you don't know any Pharisees. You're right. The Pharisee that we're talking about today was a person that existed in the imagination of Jesus. But you know someone. You know someone out there who needs to experience this kind of love. Someone out there who is standing off right now, self-righteous and at a distance. You know someone. Could you be the person who walks over to that person and bridges that distance and shows God's magnificent love? Amen.